How's it going, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the 80% Garage. In this episode, we're going to be doing a DIY for a project that I didn't find anywhere else on YouTube, and that's replacing the front subframe bushings on a C5 or B5 chassis car from Volkswagen or Audi. That's an A6, that's a Passat, that's an Allroad, which is what we're working on today. And you don't own one of those cars, you may still want to stick around because you might find the video interesting or you might learn something. But if it really doesn't interest you, we'll catch you on the next one. With that, let's dive right in. Obviously, our first step here is to get the car jacked up. I used my quick jacks. I'm going to take the wheels off here, and then I'm going to start at the rear of the subframe. Now, your rear subframe will look a little bit different because I do have an aftermarket drivetrain stabilizer, and instead of this nice milled aluminum piece, yours will be stamped steel, but the same 3 bolts are there. 1 subframe bolt and the 2 little ones in the back. At some point, you're going to want to remove these 2 bolts on each side. These are the transmission mount bolts, and they tie directly into the subframe. If you don't remove these, you won't be able to lower the subframe enough to get to the top side of the subframe bushing to pull it down through. Now, if you don't have an Allroad, you won't have this spacer. It's a little 20mm spacer that pushes the entire subframe down so that the car sits a little higher. Here's a quick view of the top of the bushing that we're working on. You can see the roll pin that holds that spacer in place. Now, on to the fun part, actual bushing removal. To be honest, this was probably the hardest part of this entire job. Getting the very old bushing separated from the steel, even though the outside was plastic and not metal. It was extremely hard to get apart. You could tell that they had been together for the entire 20 years that this car had been on the road. So I started off with a chisel. I made enough space so that I could come in with my oscillating tool and I could trim that flange off. Now, why am I trimming the flange off? Well, the only way to get these bushings out is to push them down through from the top out the bottom. And the tool that I have, which is a cup press tool, needs to have something to sit on that I can pull the bushing into. And you'll see here, I was able to get the nut on the other side with a small disc, and now I'm going to start the process of pulling it through. But once I get that cup seated, you'll see if I didn't have that extra space, I wouldn't have been able to pull this out. I really needed the lip for the cup to sit on. Now that it's out of the cup, we can see where I cut the edge off and how we were able to bring it down through. And there's just a good view of the roll pin that holds that all-road specific spacer in place. It was a lot of work to get here, but there it is. 1 bushing out. Looks pretty darn rusty in there, so you can see why it was a little bit difficult to get those separated. Time to tackle the passenger side. So I've already done the chiseling around the edge. I was able to get this oscillating tool in and follow exactly the same process for this side. There I am putting the press tool on the back side again, getting this rod threaded in so that I can put the cup on the bottom and then bring that bushing down home through. I didn't want to show you the entire process over again, but this is a little bit better view than we had on the other side, and I wanted to make sure that you got some clear camera shots of what was happening and how the entire process occurred. Now that we've pressed both of our rear subframe bushings out, we need to get the subframe ready for our new poly bushings to go back in. First thing I did was take a little bit of 220 sandpaper, clean it out as much as I could, and then I took a brass wire wheel and cleaned up as much of the outside as I could. Now you see me using a screwdriver there, and that's because there was some very scaly rust there at that top transition, and I wanted to make sure that I broke that off before I put the new bushing back in to make sure that we didn't have any issues. As with every polyurethane bushing install, you are going to want to apply a fairly liberal coating of silicone grease. Once you get it all coated up, it is as easy as pushing the two halves of the bushing through, and then I had a little bit of trouble with the center part of the bushing, but nothing that a C-clamp couldn't help me with. I went ahead and popped the spacer back on the top and went to work on the passenger side. Just showing you that I removed the roll pin from the one side of the spacer. We aren't going to need it. This spacer is sandwiched between the subframe and the body of the car, and it allows me to run these standard C5 chassis bushings without any modification. We can start to button up the rear of this subframe now. I'm going to tighten this subframe bolt in so that we can pull the sleeve all the way through and seat it against the spacer in the body of the car. Once I get that done, I'm going to move over to the driver's side, and I'm going to do exactly the same thing. Before we move to the front of the car, we want to make sure that we don't forget this step. We need to put this bar back in place because this is what holds everything together. This is essentially what creates a giant washer in the bottom of the bushing that holds it up against the car. If you didn't bolt this back in place, the subframe could actually slip past the washers and the bolts. We are halfway done. What a great feeling. Now, if you've ever worked on the front of one of these B5 or C5 chassis cars, you know that what we have to remove right now holds up about 3/4 of the front of the car. The engine mounts bolt into it, it bolts to the frame, and then it bolts into the subframe. This is a tricky part to get out. There's 2 bolts that I'm undoing now that hold it to the chassis of the car. Then I've already undone the sway bar mount and the engine mount. And now we're just undoing the subframe mount. In addition to these ride height controller components, there is an electrical connector on the driver's side engine mount, which is a little bit difficult to remove. Take your time, it'll come off. With that mount removed, now we can reach up and remove our spacer. Look closely and you will see the roll pin still in the bushing there, and then a shot with it out, and there is that pesky little roll pin. With that removed, you can go ahead and put the pressing tool on top, and we will proceed to getting it out the bottom. At this point, you should know the drill. We're on our 3rd bushing. We're going to break the flange free, and then we're going to come back in with the multi-tool, and we're going to cut that flange off. I did switch to a screwdriver that I sharpened because it seemed to work a little bit better than the chisel. Once again, I did change my technique a little on this one. I went ahead and pre-loaded the cup and the pressing tool at the exact depth that I wanted it, and it saved me a minute or so of threading that rod all the way up. Now we're going to get a nice view of this bushing being pulled all the way down into that cup. Here we go, silicone grease, top, bottom, sleeve, spacer. It's the final bushing. We're going to follow exactly the same process as the other three. Break off the flange, get the pressing tool in place on top, and then pull the bushing home into the cup. Man, even at 10x it takes a long time to pull that bushing out of the subframe. Same process as before, bottom, top, sleeve, spacer, done. With all 4 bushings replaced, it's time to reassemble everything. And I could just say reassembly is reverse of removal. However, that would be a little bit unfair. Putting these things back together isn't that difficult, but it's remembering the things you took off, like that electrical connector on the driver's side. As I was doing this, I did learn a little trick. If you spin the bottom nut onto the actual engine mount, it holds the aluminum part up so that you do not have to hold it while you're maneuvering all the other bolts into place. And when I say maneuvering, I really mean it. You're going to have to tighten and loosen these bolts several times so that you can get them all to engage. You can see that I'm shifting the subframe up and down and the aluminum mount side to side to make sure that I can get everything at least threaded with very little resistance before I tighten it down. Just watch how much it shifts as I do my final tightening sequence here to get everything pushed up into place. The driver's side is exactly the same as the passenger side, except you don't have to worry about that silly electrical clip. Also, I think I called it the driver's side when I was showing you the passenger side. Sorry about that. This is the driver's side. Oh, and remember, when you're working on any 20-year-old German car, you should apply anti-seize liberally. Hey, look at that, a new subframe bolt. Remember, before you tackle this project, to get new subframe bolts. Those are single use only. I'm sure some of you have gotten more than one use out of yours, but if you're going to go through all this trouble, just replace them. Obviously, you are going to need an alignment after this, but you notice that I pushed a socket extension through that hole, and that helps to line up the mount, the subframe, and the car, all 3 together, so that at least you have a starting point. After I got this aligned, they said it wasn't too far out in the front, so this does help. We could take our time here and snug everything down. Passenger side is already done. You can see I actually switched over to a pickle fork, which is a little bit better sized for those alignment holes. Hey, remember when I told you I didn't put new subframe bolts in the back? Well, now it's time to fix that. The new subframe bolts can go in. I can put the all-road specific spacer in and then tighten this whole bar down. We'll move over to the other side and we'll do exactly the same thing over there. At least that was the plan. I had an extremely hard time getting these center mount bolts to line up with the mount on the transmission. So I had to undo both sides, bring them down, get them to line up, and then kind of do a sequence across the 4 just to make sure that everything lined up and I could tighten everything without cross-threading it. Alright, couple quick things before I close the video. I was really worried about doing this because I wasn't sure that I had all the right tools. I knew I had the bushing press tool, but I wasn't sure that I could do this without an engine support bar or an engine hoist. It turns out you can. Just take your time, do 2 at a time, the fronts or the rears. I don't think it really matters where you start. I started with the rears because I thought they would actually be the harder ones to do because I didn't think it would flex as much. After replacement and an alignment, this made a night and day difference in the handling of the car. I had purchased the aftermarket stabilizer bar to try and get the slop out of the chassis, and it was really a band-aid covering up a bullet hole. This completely fixed those problems, and I'm really, really happy that I did it. I hope that this gives you the confidence to be able to go through and replace your subframe bushings as well. We'll see you next time on the 80% Garage, where we tackle something much more painful. A sneak preview for the next video. Yeah, this really sucked.